Hey, you're listening to Blindsight. Let's go. Mental health isn't something to take lightly. It's time to fight. It's time to thrive. Let's do this.
Welcome to Blindsight. This is Bill Lundgren, your host, and I'm delighted to have you with us today. A couple announcements before we begin. First off, want to let you know in the beginning of June, there's going to be a new sports and blind athletes. There'll be this program on Game Changers, which will be something really to look forward to. And also, if you have some ideas for our program, don't hesitate to send us an email at feedback@aftersight.org or give us a phone call, feedback at 720-712-8856. Okay, with that, we will go to our program, and I'm delighted to have Olivia Weeks on. Today, we're going to be talking about methamphetamines. So, Olivia, welcome to Blindsight.
Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. First, I'd like to get a little bit of information about you, how you come on to this subject of methamphetamines, and we can go from there.
Yeah, that sounds good. My name is Olivia. I'm a contributor for the Daily Yonder. I write stories for them, and I've also made this 5-part podcast series called Home Cooked, a 50-year history of meth in America.
Okay.
Yeah. And I started thinking a lot about meth several years ago because it seemed like I had heard a lot about methamphetamine when I was a kid. I'm from a very small town in southern Illinois, coal country, and I'd heard a lot about meth lab explosions and stuff like that. It seemed like a very dramatic problem in my hometown when I was a little kid, and then that was in the early 2000s. And then the issue kind of disappeared from public discourse in my area for a little while, I think during my teenage years. And then when I was in college in about 2018, when I began college, it really became the talk of the town all over again. And I noticed that that was not just in my area. It was a kind of national trend. There were a lot of news stories about how meth was back with a vengeance, and it was, it wasn't your neighbors cooking it anymore. It seemed like a totally new drug phenomenon. And so that's how I got interested. And then the Daily Yonder's part in it is that we're a rural news source really focused on perceptions of rural America and rural American politics and stuff like that. And so, meth has this association with the countryside and this reputation as a kind of hillbilly drug. And so we were interested in looking into that stereotype and looking into that association between meth and rural places and sort of seeing where it came from and what the reality of it is today. We found that there was some real sort of material reasons for that association between meth and the country, and that's partially that in the late 90s and early 2000s, this way of making meth got popular called the Birch reduction method, and it was often popularly called the Nazi method, and I'm not exactly sure why that is. I think that it has something to do with the mythology of the German military using methamphetamine to keep its soldiers' spirits high in World War II. But I'm not sure why this particular method of making meth got associated with the Nazis. But anyways, that way of making meth was really popular in the 90s and early 2000s, especially in the Midwest and especially in the rural Midwest. And that was because you needed sort of wide open spaces in order to make the drug this way because it smelled really bad. And also because one of the ingredients in this sort of home-styled version of the Birch reduction method is anhydrous ammonia, which is a farm fertilizer. And so there were a lot of people who got pretty good at stealing farm fertilizer, and so it helped to be in a rural area. And then also just they sell it at the farm supply store, and so that was helpful. So I don't know. And then there's some other reasons why making meth became popular in the countryside. And what we found is that reputation sort of stuck around long past its expiration date. So today, methamphetamine is no longer produced very frequently domestically. It's usually produced in Mexico in these larger scale, sort of industrialized labs. And in the US, it's not really made in this sort of mom and pop way anymore. And so that means that it's much less geographically specific as a drug. So it's no longer that there's like a fad for making methamphetamine in Missouri. It's more that methamphetamine is trafficked along pretty traditional drug routes, the way that, say, cocaine would be, or the way that fentanyl is today. And so that makes it a much less geographically specific problem, and it means that meth is really prevalent in rural, suburban, and urban areas.
Yeah, it used to be called the poor man's coke.
Right.
And so, because it can be made, it's a lot cheaper than buying it off the street. But now, off the street, is this still cheap?
It's cheaper than ever right now, largely because traffickers in Mexico, all kinds of traffickers, you hear them described as cartels, but it's really like a large, bustling free market of manufacturers and traffickers within Mexico are very good at making methamphetamine, and they really have a thoroughly developed supply chain for the precursor chemicals necessary to make it. And so the DEA is seizing more methamphetamine than ever before. There's a lot of it on the street, and it's very cheap right now.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people being affected by it. And particularly, at least what I'm hearing in the urban areas, being mixed with fentanyl, which is can be quite deadly, especially if you're not used to any of that.
Yeah, definitely. And you hear about that in rural places too. Sometimes it's hard to parse out fear about fentanyl contamination from actual fentanyl contamination, but there are studies that have shown that many people using drugs in rural areas who think that they're only using opioids have tested positive for opioids and methamphetamine.
Well, one of the things in the urban areas, a library down in Colorado Springs was closed for a while because they had to clean out the bathrooms, which were being used for meth by people who are unhoused or had to couldn't use any place else. So the libraries get closed because they were afraid of the contamination.
Yeah, I read a little bit about that. I think, it makes sense that people wouldn't want methamphetamine being used in their public libraries on a lot of different levels. But I've also read where public health officials have said that, there really is no danger from using a bathroom where methamphetamine was used. So the contamination thing, I think, has been overblown a little bit. Though, of course, if there's meth left sitting out on a counter, that could be dangerous for a child. But I think it's not like it's going to seep into the walls or something.
So what's wrong with getting high on meth?
Well, do you mean in that context or more broadly?
Pardon?
Do you mean in that context or more broadly? In the library context or
more broadly? Well, in the individual, what's the attraction and how dangerous is it?
Yeah, one of the major findings of the podcast was that using meth has been more and less dangerous at various points throughout its history. So, at one point, methamphetamine was widely prescribed, sort of the way that a drug like Adderall is. And the dangers of using meth back then are that, it is a strong drug. It does have cardiac effects on the body. It has a lot of similar side effects to currently commonly prescribed stimulant medications. And methamphetamine actually is still a Schedule II prescription drug. It's very rarely prescribed at this point, but it can be prescribed for rare conditions like narcolepsy and also for off-label use as a weight loss drug. And so I think even though meth has been stigmatized to a great degree, the U.S. FDA is still comfortable with meth prescription in some cases. And so the reason I think that's interesting and important is that meth itself, the chemical compound methamphetamine, poses much fewer and much smaller risks than the drug methamphetamine in a social context where it's outlawed. And so I think, even when methamphetamine was legal, it was easy to get your hands on, it was widely prescribed, it did still have these side effects, but they were side effects that many people would be comfortable with as long as they came in prescription drug form. Now, meth got more dangerous over time because it is now made on the black market. And when something's made on the black market, you don't know what it's cut with and you don't know what kind of dose you're taking. And often people go from ingesting methamphetamine orally to smoking it or to injecting it, which means that you get a much sharper and more intense high, and the dangers are greater. Now, in the early 2000s, one of the major dangers of using meth was that a lot of people were making it on their own. Now, this was never quite very true in Colorado. I think in Colorado and much of the Western US, meth was pretty much always purchased from drug trafficking organizations, either based in Mexico or in the Southwest. So Colorado had less of this sort of rural mom and pop lab problem. But in places where that was a big problem, methamphetamine contamination was a big problem because you can have these explosions, you're using chemicals and you're mixing chemicals together that, you should really have a chemistry degree in order to do that. And so people were getting hurt that way. And then today, one of the major dangers of using methamphetamine is, as we've already mentioned, fentanyl contamination. And so I think it's important to point out that neither of those problems come from the actual chemical methamphetamine. They come from the social context in which the drug is used.
Right. But there's one additional problem, and that is that the potential, as with prescription drugs or whatever, of the use greater than prescribed. Mm-hmm. In other words, an addiction. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the major things that people are finding. And this is true. This sometimes is true for Adderall, mm-hmm. where people are misusing them and consequently becoming addicts. And the one thing, as I understand it too, when you're not using, people who will go into a depression if they're in a withdrawal state from amphetamines. And because what's happening with any of this particular group of meds is that the body is so used to the stimulation coming outside of from the prescription, the body kind of stops making the feel-good substance within the body, and consequently, in withdrawal is a depression, mm-hmm. which of course reinforces people to use more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly a major problem. I think I'm not, an expert on the science of this, but I have spoken with people who are, and they definitely point out that anhedonia, or that state of depression that you described, is a major problem in withdrawing from methamphetamine. Right. And
it's the same problem for cocaine. That's one of the things about cocaine, even trying to get people off cocaine, and the same for methamphetamine, is that period of time where it's just very, very uncomfortable depression, and they just want so much to go back on it to relieve that.
Right. And it's more difficult when you're using higher doses of the drug, which again, I think is more common when the drug is outlawed. So because methamphetamine is outlawed, it's used pretty commonly in much, much higher doses than people would have used it if they had a prescription back in the day. And so that makes mm-hmm. that withdrawal process much more difficult.
Yeah. So we have the quality problem, and we have just in terms of not having any handle on the quality of the street drug, mm-hmm. but also in terms of just monitoring how much people are using, and we have time and time again, we have people who are totally not able to work. They're just out there trying to deal with their habit. And, and families are just so frustrated as to what to do.
Mm-hmm.
What are the common ways that people are getting off of meth?
Yeah, so I think one thing about methamphetamine is that unlike with opioids, there are no approved medication assisted treatments
That's what I
for
thought. Mm-hmm.
getting off of
Yeah.
methamphetamine. And so that's difficult because with opioids, you can take a drug that you can get an injection that makes your cravings for opioids much
Right.
less powerful. And with meth, that does not quite exist. And so one thing that is encouraging is that for a long time, I think activists in the field felt as if there was not enough attention to methamphetamine use and as if all of
Mm-hmm.
the sort of attention and funding and energy was sort of behind solving the opioid addiction problem, which I think sort of makes sense because even though meth-related overdose deaths are on the rise, you're probably quite a bit more likely to be killed by an opioid than by a stimulant like methamphetamine. And so it sort of makes sense that there's a lot of attention on opioids. However, I think it left a lot of activists and scientists in the field feeling like, okay, when are we going to pay attention to this methamphetamine problem? And in several states, I know that there's been movement to get some of the opioid settlement money from the cases against Purdue Pharma to apply to methamphetamine research and harm reduction efforts. So there's some hope there. And then I think the main thing that I learned from speaking with people who used drugs or people who were formerly addicted to meth is that, it really just takes a lot of tries. I think it takes, for a lot of people, it takes a lot of tries to get clean from meth once and for all.
Yeah.
And it's
Absolutely.
not a perfect science, it's an art and it's a major effort. And so, I don't know. I think a lot of the movement in the field right now is towards harm reduction approaches. So trying to get people those fentanyl test strips and clean needles and that kind of thing in order to keep them alive long enough to decide that, okay, this time I'm really getting clean. So that's where a lot of the attention is right now. And that doesn't feel like a satisfying conclusion to me, but
no, not yet.
Yeah.
But the other piece of it is the realistic piece, particularly when we're talking about rural areas. There ain't too many therapists out there.
No, beds are always full. Transportation times are always really long. Even people who are in their sort of court-mandated drug court have a really hard time making it to court. That's a major problem in rural places. I mean, if you've gotten lots of felony convictions for drug charges, there's a good chance that you don't have a driver's license either, and you don't have the money to pay somebody to take you to court. Yeah,
exactly. And my understanding also in terms of just basic taking care of yourself, hygiene, it just doesn't happen. So I've had clients who've had lost teeth because they just weren't taking care of themselves when they were on meth runs. And consequently, the whole, their body is affected by what they're doing. And there's nothing out there yet to put some control on helping them.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I think there has been a sort of outsized focus on the physical effects of methamphetamine on people. I think that that's true of a lot of different drugs that, it might sometimes have a visible outward effect on the way you look.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of this sort of hillbilly stereotype. I think it was very satisfying for people to see photos of meth users who have lost teeth, whose hygiene is really in decline, because it really fits this stereotype that we have about hillbilly cocaine or whatever.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it can't be denied that those secondary effects do come with drug use.
And plus, when you're spending time trying to find meth or to use it, then there's really no energy for anything else. And that's the sad part about it. It's a continual spiral, as I understand it. That makes sense?
Yeah, I do think that one thing that people sort of miss in this conversation is that I think there are a lot of people who use meth in different ways. There are communities who use
Right.
meth as a party drug recreationally, and who are able to keep a sort of, very possibly problematic, but less downward spiraling relationship to the drug. And I think that those people are less visible because they don't sort of fit this physical stereotype of the meth user that we have in mind. So I think that's important to note. Like, there are a lot of people historically who have only ingested meth orally, and I think smoking is really what leads to that tooth decay. And it's a common enough drug that it's often used recreationally in the way that you might think of cocaine being used in a different era. And so I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and that's the difficult part in terms of a number of drugs like cocaine, like methamphetamines, and used recreationally, and they're under the radar because they're not used enough to lead to addiction. But it's sometimes it's very hard to identify who's going to become the addict and who's just going to use recreationally. The same with alcohol. All of these things are used, but the question is who's going to get into trouble with it, and also are the resources there to help them? And that's when we start. And as you say, in the rural area, it becomes a little more problematic.
Right.
Or even for example, the alcoholic out in the rural area is going to have a harder time finding a therapist that can help him or her. In the area would have to go into an urban area, and sometimes people get very discouraged from trying to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I don't want to downplay the risk of addiction, or especially in this current era of accidental fentanyl poisoning or something like that.
Right.
However,
right. Mm-hmm.
I do think that there, especially in time periods where the meth that was on the street was less pure, I think that there might have been a lot of people who were, happy with the amount of meth that they were using for a little while, or for long periods of time. I don't think you can rule that out. So I think that the idea that using meth once means that you're going to be addicted, I think that idea is very dangerous.
Right, exactly.
And we need to avoid
the myth. That's the myth that we have with a lot of this, a lot of products. The problem is that people do get in trouble with it. And as you say, with meth, there isn't yet the kind of solution to help people who are running into trouble other than the abstinence, which is not working very well, or putting them in a situation where they're able to use with less danger,
mm-hmm.
with that, with less problem. And even, we're talking about anything, including prescription medication. There are people who are going to abuse prescription medication.
Mm-hmm.
And it's frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
It's frustrating because we really don't have a handle on, what everybody is, the media is calling the drug crisis, a way of, other than being honest and saying, this is the way it is. Here are some things that we can do to modify the danger.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't reached that point yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we're sort of fumbling through the dark for a way forward, but but yeah, being honest is where we can start. And I think that was really a goal of this podcast, was to try to dispel some of those more stigmatizing myths about methamphetamine.
Well, what would you like to see happen?
I honestly do not know. I really believe in the power of harm reduction efforts, both just in keeping people alive. I think that's a deeply unsatisfying sort of end game, but I believe that harm reductionists who are actually in the field speaking with people who use drugs in a non-punitive, non-stigmatizing way definitely have the best understanding of the drug landscape right now. And I think that we really need their insights. We really need them on the ground helping people and providing that path into recovery whenever a user is ready for it. And I also think that we really need their insights sort of in the public policy space. And hopefully, I would like to see this problem get just enough better that those harm reductionists, some of them, can really look beyond the day-to-day keeping people alive and start to make recommendations and start to come up with big ideas about changing our landscape. I think that the conversation about decriminalization is interesting. I think it's always going to feel unsatisfying to people, but it might be a good next step. I don't know. But I really believe in the power of harm reduction to sort of begin moving us forward.
Sure. But we have to change the mindset that we have, which I think is slowly happening, but it's a little too slow.
Yeah. And I think another big reason why we wanted to do this podcast is that I think mindsets were changing a little bit around opioid use disorder and around people who used opioids, because there was this narrative about the person who got an opioid prescription because they were a hard worker and they hurt their back in the mine or whatever. And they got this opioid prescription, got addicted through no fault of their own, and then turned to heroin or fentanyl, whatever came after that. And I think that narrative did a lot to destigmatize opioid users. And I think that largely because of this cultural baggage from the early 2000s and this association with kind of our worst images of hillbillies, methamphetamine did not undergo that reputational revamping that I think some types of opioid users were benefit to during the height of the prescription opioid epidemic. And so I think another finding from the podcast that I thought was interesting and that I think is important and relates to this is that a lot of people have used methamphetamine not just recreationally, but vocationally in a similar way to the salt of the earth opioid user that I just described, which is that people will use methamphetamine in order to work longer and harder hours. It's sort of rampant within the construction industry and poultry industry. These really hard, grueling jobs, people will use methamphetamine in order to make it through the day and in order to be better workers. And so I think if we value that, if we think that, hard work makes a drug user more sympathetic to us, then which I think is a problematic idea, but if we think that, then I think that it applies to methamphetamine too.
Yeah. Well, I knew someone who said, I hate cleaning house. So, he took a hit of amphetamine to give him the energy to clean his place, and it worked for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way that a lot of people use their Adderall prescriptions, which is a very chemically similar drug.
Yes. But the thing is, again, Adderall has been proving some problems, but it's not. Adderall does not seem to be on the black market. So somehow people sort of can turn a blind eye, and in fact may not even realize that someone is in trouble with that if they're in trouble with Adderall because it's quote prescription, and it has a whole lot of the drugs that we're talking about have a whole lot of things that just not the medical part. It's the it can sometimes be racially based in antagonism, or like you say, the hillbilly stereotype and so forth. It's all this garbage that's around the medications that we're talking about, more than the drug itself. I think that's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your thoughts about the next thing that anyone in the community can do? You mentioned harm reduction, but what does that mean that the people out there who are concerned about this problem need to do?
Yeah, I really wish that I had a more satisfying answer to this question. I think one thing that you can do is you can look for a harm reduction organization in your local area. You can donate clean needles. You can volunteer there distributing. I think that's the best use of the layperson's effort, honestly.
Well, I think the other thing that may need to happen is for people, particularly the families who are caught up in this, to talk to their legislators, because that's where the regulations are coming from.
Yeah, that's a
And
great
the
point.
legislators are blocking harm reduction places. And in fact, everybody, when somebody offers to set up a harm reduction unit, they say, not in our neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of education that has to come in, because we have a choice of letting people die. We have a choice of letting them go down the tube generally, or we have, a way of controlling it until we get a solution that's a little more viable in the case of stimulants. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I'm not sure what the situation in Colorado is, but I know, for instance, in Missouri, it was a major battle just to even be able to distribute fentanyl test strips, which the only purpose of a fentanyl test strip is to prevent overdose and death. So, yeah.
Right, but then they say, well, that only encourages the use. No.
Yeah, that's definitely not how I see it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that the message of your podcast is good. It's certainly the question is how do we get people to get themselves clean, and how to help them in any way that we can, rather than let them die or deteriorate like that. Well, I certainly appreciate you being on today, and your podcast. Thank you for what you're doing, and this hope that you can keep in touch and let us know what's happening, what you're hearing happening in the rural area.
Yep, that sounds great. Thanks so much for having me on. And again, the podcast is called Home Cooked, and you can find it on the Rural Remix podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, thank you. And this is Bill Lundgren, your host for Blindsight, and we look forward to getting together with you again. And I'll say again, if you have any thoughts or any comments about today's program, let us know either through an email to feedback@aftersight.org or by telephone. And that's telephone number is 720-712-8856. Thank you very much.